Chapter 3, Cultural Evolution. A lot of people like to think that their culture was just all of a sudden created in a blinding flash of light. But the reality is that all cultures, no matter which one you're talking about, all cultures evolved from another more primitive culture. And that's just the way it is. Animals evolved, if you believe in evolution. Of course, if you don't believe in evolution, then that's a word that you don't want to hear. But there are a lot of individuals that like to think that their culture just suddenly appeared in a flash of light. And and like I said, the reality is that things evolved, no matter whether you're Western or indigenous or Eastern. There is a history behind your culture, and of course, what do they call it? What did I take? Western civilization when I was in college, and that was, I don't know, 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. Um, so we all cultures evolve or have evolved. Different environments affect the ways that people go about living their lives. Some of the ways that physical environments affect culture are quite direct. The difference between where you live and where I live is very much different. I have to mow my yard, the grass in my yard, at least once a week. If I don't, it gets so tall I could probably bale it. If you think I'm kidding, if you've never seen anything like that, then I invite you to come up here and mow my lawn for me. It takes, I've got about 5 acres of lawn, about 5 acres of lawn. And so it takes a while. This is a really green place. Trees grow really tall. And this is where we grow a lot of grain. The field to our north has corn in it, and the field to our south has soybeans. Field to our south is about 100 acres. The one to our north is about 25 acres. So we're surrounded by fields. The field to our west is, I'm not sure what he's got in there. I'm guessing it's soybeans this year because he planted corn last year. But I'm surrounded by fields, and you guys live pretty much in a desert. Um, and you can grow things, but you have to water them. Here, you don't have to water things because it rains enough to provide enough moisture for everything to grow fairly well. So, we just live in different environments, and hence the people that live where I live on farms because they can grow lots and lots of food with not very many acres. We can, an example, we can um, feed 10 cows on an acre of land, on an acre of grass. And where you live, or at least where I lived in Texas, it took 10 acres to feed one cow. So there's a lot of difference between where we live. Grass grows naturally here if you don't mow it, if you don't make sure nothing's growing there, then trees will grow. I've got about 50 black walnut trees growing in my side yard because we have a black walnut tree right there. So, I mean, if we didn't mow, we would have masses of trees in our yard. Anyway, there are no large indigenous mammals on the Hawaiian Islands. Therefore, the Hawaiians do not have any hunting traditions because there are no animals to hunt. This is uh, this is one of my favorite fish. I used to have a shirt with this on there. Hama hama nuka nuka apawa'a. That's the state fish of Hawaii, and I used to have a T-shirt with that on it. Hama hama nuka nuka apawa'a. So the Hawaiians don't hunt anything large because there's nothing large to hunt. The Kung of the Kalahari live in an environment surrounded by large animals and derive much of their caloric intake by hunting these animals, especially They don't hunt elephants, but they do hunt the smaller antelope. The Kung have a strong hunting tradition because there are so many large things to hunt, and sometimes they don't survive the hunt because these animals are very dangerous. There's lions and leopards and rhinoceri. Elephants, of course, aren't safe, especially when they're stampeding. Zebras are fairly dangerous. If you know anything about zebras, they bite and they cause a lot of injuries. The number one the animal that kills more people in Africa is than any other animal. It's not the lion; it's the hippopotamus. Strangely enough. So there you go. The kinds of foods that are available within a given ecology affect the kinds of foraging behaviors that people engage in. And of course, here we see all of the nuts and berries, and this is a squirrel. When I was young, everybody hunted squirrels. They kind of taste like chicken, not not too much, but it's all dark meat. Um, that's a fox squirrel. It's red, like a fox. Anyway, so wherever you live, of course, where you guys live, you don't have fox squirrels, but you do have prairie dogs and other smaller rodents that you can hunt. According to Gilmore in 1990, in those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and the toughness of males are more likely to emerge. Places where it's difficult to eke out a living. Uh, these are places for male, uh, bold males who are willing to go out and hunt. And a lot of times they didn't come back. Places where large game is hunted, such as the plains where the buffalo roamed. Places where risky deep sea fishing is performed. On the South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep sea fishing expeditions to secure food for their families. The Truckees greatly value masculinity, which is manifested by young men engaging in frequent, violent, drunken melees with knives and clubs because masculinity, because testosterone is really important there. And in order for you to prove your masculinity, you have to have a high testosterone level, and that makes you a little bit more aggressive. And so they fight each other. The cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful and more easily acquired, more androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not need to hunt and fish because fish are readily available in shallow lagoons. And it was this way on Hawaii as well. On Hawaii, there was fruit that grew very readily, and there were shallow lagoons where it was easy to catch fish. So because of that, whereas the Truckees had to go out and prove their mettle, they had to go out and find their food. On Tahiti and in Hawaii, this wasn't the case. Now, the interesting thing was that the leaders in Tahiti and Hawaii were very often female. And that wasn't odd and it wasn't thought strange until the Europeans came and Europeans said, this can't be true. There has to be a male leader because, of course, in Europe where they had been warring for tens of thousands of years and only the strongest survived, males were always the ones in charge, or almost always the ones in charge. There is virtually no warfare and feuding on Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern with the Tahitians. The harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed. Environment shapes lifestyles. In 1532, Juan Pizarro and 168 soldiers met the Incan Emperor Atahualpa and captured the emperor and killed 7,000 Incan warriors. Within a year, the Spaniards won battle after battle against impossible odds and conquered the Incan Empire. And this was in 1532. Proximal causes. Proximal means direct and immediate. Proximal causes of the Spanish success would be the Spanish political organization drew on thousands of years of written history, ocean-going ships, steel swords and armor, horses. Smallpox decimated the Incans at the same time, so the Incans were sick. And the Spanish had steel swords and armor, whereas they were fighting against individuals with who were utilizing wicker armor and obsidian rock. Obsidian is a form. It's glass actually. It's a form of glass and stone weapons. So it was steel and armor against wicker and stone weapons. They also had horses, which were fairly large and fairly frightening. Nothing like that. The Incans had nothing like that. Their beasts of burden were llamas and alpacas. Distal means long-term and indirect. The Spaniards came from a history of environments with food sources that supported large populations. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, wheat, barley, peas, and lentils grew there. This is where sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, and cows came from. Such strong agricultural endeavors enabled the formerly nomadic people to adopt more sedentary lifestyles, which in turn allowed them to seek scientific improvements. The domestication of various animals allowed the people in the Eurasian area to live in close proximity with animals for thousands of years. Because of this proximity, diseases developed and were traded back and forth between the Eurasians and the animals, so that animal diseases now affected humans. Such diseases as measles, tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza. One of the things that we know in today's world, of course, we just had the pandemic with the coronavirus, but every fall, a new strain of influenza comes out of Asia. Now, why in the world would the flu come out of Asia? Well, the answer is because flu comes from the intermediate host, and the intermediate host in this case are pigs. And they do have pigs in Asia, and they feed the pigs on human waste. When somebody gets sick, they pass it to the pig. The pig changes while it's inside the pig, and then it's given back to humans, and it comes back to the United States usually from China, Korea, Asia. It's the Asian continent, and it comes back in a different form. And this is one of the reasons why we can't come up with a perfect vaccination for the flu. It's because primarily there are two types of flu, type A and type B, and it all depends on how much of type A there is in this flu, or how much type B there is. And if we just went 50-50 every year, sometimes it's almost all A. In which case, of course, if your vaccination was only had 50% A in it, then it wouldn't do anything to the flu. The B would overtake the shot, and it wouldn't do you any good. And this is one of the reasons. And the only way that we can come up with vaccine for the flu is to look at what happened last year and assume it's going to be something like what happened last year. And sometimes we guess fairly close to perfect, and sometimes we guess really badly, and we get a totally different strain. The coronavirus, of course, COVID-19 was a relatively, well, it's not really that new. We had an outbreak of coronavirus in the 80s, in the early 80s, in Germany when I was there. It was in the form of walking pneumonia, and well, it was coronavirus, and it only killed one person at that time. It wasn't that virulent. It didn't spread very, very readily, but it mutated over time, and it got into an animal population, and it spread in that animal population, and it mutated in that animal's population, and eventually it came back to humans in a different form, and that was COVID-19. Came back in a very, very virulent form, and as we know, there were variants that it kept evolving, it kept changing over the 2 years that we were having problems with the coronavirus. It's not over with yet. And there were some fairly uh, mortal uh, forms that came out of one came out of Chile, another one came out of India, another one came out of Italy. Um, and initially, the bad coronavirus is coming out of England, came to the United States, and there's no way to keep it out because people, are moving back and forth. We'd have to shut down all transportation everywhere in order not to spread it from one place to another. And the Indian variant was killing off lots of people in India, and all of a sudden they got into the United States, and it just spread like wildfire through the United States. Anyway, that's the way these diseases work. Now, the interesting thing about all these diseases, measles is a virus, tuberculosis is actually a bacteria, smallpox is a virus, and influenza is a virus, as is coronavirus. So these Asian or these the people in Europe live with their animals, and people in Asia live with their animals, and this is one of the good reasons not to live with your animals, because the animals act as intermediate hosts, and you'll get the disease back. Potentially, it will be mutated, and it will be in a worse, more virulent form. And this is what has been going on in Europe for tens of thousands of years. Sure, they grew large populations of humans, but at the same time, the reason they were able to do that is because of their agriculture, the crops that they were growing, and the animals that they were eating. But they were living with their animals. And even today, when we lived in Germany from 1979 to 1982, we lived in a small farming village right on the French border, and most of the houses in that town, they were houses on top, and the barns were right below them. They were down, they were in the basement, or on the first floor. So that was the barn. The barn is in the same building as the house, and this is just the way they do things. And they have done this. They've done it this way for hundreds of years. So it's really kind of interesting. I was living. It was a town called Mauschbach. Mauschbach means Mouse Creek, and the courthouse was a building right in the middle of town, and in the basement they raised pigs, and these pigs they raised them all year, and then come slaughter time, they took them out and they slaughtered them, and that's how they financed the whatever they were going to do that year. They always had a fair and whatnot. Made sausage out of the pork and whatnot. Had lots of pigs down there. Anyway, so they were living with their pigs, and strangely enough, pigs are very similar to humans, and this is always the first animal that they look at. This is what they looked at when coronavirus hit. They tried to figure out, was it the pigs? That's always the first thing they look at. I don't know if you remember, about 15 years ago, they had the bird flu, and they were finding this viral infection that was deadly. It was a respiratory disease that was in the fowl. It was in the chickens and the ducks. As it turns out, they don't have as many chickens in Asia, but they have a lot of ducks, and they had to slaughter all these millions and millions of ducks, and we couldn't transport any meat to the United States that was from Asia, that was duck or chicken. Anyway, that's the way it works, and that's the way Eurasians have have carried plagues and diseases all over the world, as has happened in Asia. I mean, like I said, influenza comes out of China every year, and now coronavirus, of course, came to the United States in 2019, hence the name COVID-19. Uh, anyway. For thousands of years, diseases swept through the cities and towns of Eurasia, killing off millions, but leaving populations of people who were immune to these scourges. When these diseases were introduced to the uninitiated populations in the Americas, the lack of immunity wiped out whole nations. The white clay people of Montana talk about 600 lodges being reduced to 60 when smallpox first struck that group in northern Montana. Burial had to take place in trees. There were so many dead. Normally, they buried their dead in the mountains because there are mountains in that area. It's not really the Rockies, it's what they call the Little Rockies. But they buried them in crevices in the mountains, and there were so many dead that they had to start burying their dead in the trees. Uh, China is a large country in Eastern Asia. In the north, the people eat and grow wheat. This is something most people think, well, if you're Chinese, you eat rice. But the reality is, of course, that northern China is a lot like where I live, and they grow wheat. In the south, where it is warmer and more humid, they grow and eat rice. And it's the same way in the United States, actually. In the north, where I live, in Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, they grow wheat. But down along the coast in Louisiana and South Carolina, along the coast in Georgia and Alabama, they grow rice. Because there is a vast difference between growing rice and wheat, the two areas have developed different social structures. And this is pretty much it. This is the northern portion of China. It gets cold up here. The people are different. They are very much different than the people in the south. And we're going to talk about that right now. You think of China, everybody, all the Chinese look and act the same. This is not true at all. Rice is cultivated in paddies, plots of standing water. We saw this in Vietnam, rice paddies all over Vietnam. That was their staple food. There has to be sufficient rainfall where it is channeled through irrigation canals. This requires a great deal of coordination and cooperation between farmers. Rice farming is labor intensive, often requiring work by whole families. And as you can see, they have to plant the rice by hand. They have to stick the rice plant down. If it's not wet enough, then it's not going to work. So they're slogging around in this in a pool that's above your ankles anyway. You don't want to go walking in there. They also fertilize it with human feces, so it gets to be pretty interesting smell. Wheat farming is done in fields that rarely require irrigation. The wheat farmer does not have to cooperate with his neighbors. Wheat farming is far less labor intensive. So here we have cooperation has to be had between all the farmers in order to get all the water to the rice paddies. But wheat farmers, they can do anything that they want because they've got all the moisture that they need. All they need to do is throw those seeds out there, and they've got a crop. Looking at people from northern and southern China, researchers discovered that rice growers from the south showed more interdependent thinking styles. They saw themselves as part of a network. They were tolerant of nepotism. They engaged in more holistic reasoning. And in other words, the people in the south are more collectivistic than the people of the north. Now, this is really kind of interesting because I recognize this in China, but not so much in the United States. So I'm going to show you a film from China showing the difference between somebody who's northern Chinese and somebody who's from southern China. Northern China are more individualistic. Southern China is more collectivistic.
美女，能给我你的电话号码吗？
This is a lady from the north.
喝呀喝呀喝呀！干杯！Come on, pussy！
亲爱的，要不要来一点？
可是我喝一点点就会很晕嘞。
就来一点点啦。啊！这是我特意为你做的。
哇塞，你好厉害呀，亲爱的！
哎，怎么样？怎么样？哎，What's your problem？
别打了！
哎，Go！ 我抱歉，哎，What's your problem？ 哎，我该死！
好恐怖，我不敢看。
亲爱的，我先不要看了这个。
这有什么好怕？抢我包！好讨厌！哇塞，你看这个男的长得很帅，有没有？干杯！干杯！干杯！干杯！干杯！干杯！
最爱你的人是我，你怎么舍得我？许多故事有伤心的理由，这一次我的爱情。
The difference between people from the north and people from the south, and the difference, as you saw, had to do with being more individualistic than and collectivistic. So the northerners, which are wheat farmers, more individualistic, and they're just a little bit bolder than the people from the south. So when you think of somebody from China, of course, you're thinking of somebody from Shanghai. So they would be more like the lady on the right, and the lady on the left scared me. Anyway, okay. Whoops. Evoke culture is the idea that people, no matter where they are from, have certain biologically encoded behavioral patterns that can be evoked when a certain circumstance arises. When threatened, the capacity to act in an intimidating manner is universally present, especially when loved ones are threatened. So no matter who you are, and whether you are from the north or the south of China, of course, if your family is threatened, you're likely to react in an aggressive manner. Another example of evoked culture is attractiveness in a mate. People around the world prefer mates who are physically attractive. Attractive people are less likely to have parasites attractive people tend to be healthier. Thus, humans have inherited preferences for attractive mates, both males and females. When there's little threat from parasites or an unhealthy environment, other criteria can be used to select a mate: intelligence, kindness, sense of humor. In areas that are unhealthy, attractiveness is of prime importance. When people learn cultural practices by social learning or by modeling others, it is known as transmitted culture. If you watch your neighbor growing tomatoes in a hanging pot, you have learned you've learned much such planting practices by observing. Oh, wait a minute, my wife's telling me something. This may take a while. We are just on slide 4 of 28. Okay. She's learning how to be a poll worker, actually a poll captain. So we're going to be in the next election. I'm going to be a poll worker as well, but she's going to be my boss. Like she hasn't been my boss all of our married life anyway. Despite the fact that the Dinka and the Nuer have lived beside each other for hundreds of years, and they are both nomadic cattle herders and eat the same foodstuffs, and descended from the same ancestors 1,000 years ago, their cultures are very much different. This is a Dinka, the one on the top. Wait a minute. Okay, let me go back down here, get my arrow. This is a Dinka, and this guy is a Nuer. As you can see, they both use scarification, but they are in different patterns. So if you saw this guy in the marketplace, you would know that he's a Dinka. If you saw this guy in the marketplace, you would know from his scars that he is a Nuer. The Nuer raise large herds of cattle and live off the milk. The Dinka butcher their herds and rely on the meat. The Dinka maintain tribal relationships with families they live near. The Nuer maintain kinship based on the male line, and they don't really interact with the other tribes in their area. The Nuer are a larger and more militaristic tribe. The Nuer maintain costly and flexible dowry payments for their daughters, while the Dinka have small, flexible payments. Biological evolution occurs when certain genes become more common in a population than they were in the past. Biological evolution operates through natural selection. Natural selection is the evolutionary process that occurs under these conditions. Individual variability exists among members of a species on certain traits. The traits are associated with different reproductive rates. The traits have a hereditary basis. So in my family, let me think of a positive trait that my family has. We have a strong immune system. Where we got this strong immune system, I'm not exactly sure. But both my parents, my dad, mom and my dad, were hardly ever sick. I haven't been sick since I was in the Air Force. So we have these amazing immune systems. I never get a flu shot, and haven't had the flu since I got a flu shot back in the 1970s. So I never get the flu, and I never catch colds. It's just the way it is, kinda. So that's that's a biological trait. That's something that has been passed on. My grandson never gets sick. My daughter never gets sick. My son never gets sick. It's just a biological trait that we have passed down, this strong immune system. What else? What else is there? We don't scar very well. Some people, they get a cut and it immediately turns into a wound, and that wound stays open and it scars. But my people don't scar very much. The people that I'm related to, anyway. I'm not saying all white people are this way. I'm saying I'm this way. Fast-running antelope may have an advantage in outrunning predators. The trade-off would be that their increased muscle mass would require increased food to maintain them. Slow-running antelope may be more susceptible to predators, but in a time of drought when the food sources are limited, they are more likely to survive than the fast-running antelope because they have more muscle mass and they have more mass to fall back on. Cultural evolution is where ideas are carried forward from generation to generation. Cultural evolution follows natural selection, as some ideas are more selectable in a culture than others. And two of these ideas are religions and political structures. Now, you might think, religions, what are you talking about? Well, religions seem to be fairly universal. Not everybody has a religion, of course, but there are major religions in just about every country in the United States, in the world. It's the same thing with political structures. For the longest time, monarchies were the most prevalent. Now we have democracies and totalitarian type governments. And this is, of course, something that we are dealing with right now in the Ukraine and Russia. Russia, of course, has a president that has been elected for not for life. I think that he can serve until like 2034. But the Ukraine, of course, the president was just elected not very long ago. The person that was in charge before he was elected was very friendly to Russia, and this is one of the reasons why the Russians have attacked the Ukraine, because they don't have as much control over that country as they did before. Copying errors are very common with cultural ideas. Copying errors or mutations are rare among genes. The idea of a bathing suit, as you can see, this is what it looked like in 1875. This is what it looked like 25 years later. And this is what it looked like 25 years later. This is what it looked like 25 years later. Before, you couldn't see the female form very well. All of a sudden in 25 and 27, you could see the female form. You could see what her legs looked like. You could see what her arms looked like. But before that, of course, everything was pretty much covered. Anyway, so that's copying errors as we and things can change very quickly. And when we're talking about fashion, we're talking about hairdos. But as far as copying errors are concerned, for genes, it's very rare. The way you are, you will not evolve. There is no evolution that an individual can do. They can change over time, but it won't change their genes. The only way that you potentially can mutate is to reproduce, and possibly your offspring will have mutated genes, but you can't. Once you're born, that's it. You are what you are. Genes pass slowly. Genes pass vertically from parent to offspring. Culture passes horizontally from one person to anyone they come in contact with. Cultural evolution can be very rapid, as we saw with the swimming suits. Now, potentially these two women were alive at the same time. This one was probably there's 50 years difference between these between this swimming suit and this swimming suit. She was potentially 75 when this young lady wore her swimming suit. So she potentially saw women wearing a different swimming suit. While genes have been adaptive to be repeated, cultural ideas do not have to be adaptive. Even maladaptive ideas can spread, as with the headhunters of New Guinea, when half of them died due to a degenerative disease passed from diseased victims. It was Jacob Creutzfeldt disease. It is a mutation of the protein in the brain. It's also known as mad cow disease, but in humans it's known as Jacob Creutzfeldt disease. The protein, instead of being an intact protein, is something they call a prion, and this prion will infect all the protein around it. And what it does, it creates a ball of non-functional protein. So what it does, it makes it look like there are holes in this person's brain. And unfortunately, because the headhunters ate the brains of the individuals that they killed, the warriors that they killed, and some of them had Jacob's Creutzfeldt disease. They contracted it too. All you have to do is eat it, and the prion gets into your system, and then now all of a sudden you've got the disease as well. But it wiped out half of the headhunters in New Guinea, which is one of the reasons why there aren't as many headhunters in New Guinea now as there once were. Dynamic social impact theory posits that individuals come to influence each other, and they do so primarily in terms of how often the individuals interact, which ultimately leads to clusters of like-minded people who are separated by geography, cultures, in other words. Norms develop among those who communicate with each other regularly. And I can't remember why I had Zac Efron in this picture. There was a reason. That's from a movie where I can't remember. Girls, girls, girls. It says right there. They were trying to get people to come to their fraternity. And Zac Efron was cooking outside in front of the house. And of course, since he's so beautiful, all these women flocked around him. And that brought in all of these other guys. Anyway. You need to communicate regularly. In 2007, Callum and Hurton followed a group of students for a year. The researchers set a baseline by discovering the students' attitudes before they became students. The researchers discovered that the students that lived in the same dorms and ate in the same dining halls maintained similar attitudes no matter what attitudes they had before coming to school. The students began building microcultures within their living units. Cultures emerge when people communicate, and this is how relationships work. When I was in college, I went to a college with a lot of fraternities. 75% of the student population were members of fraternities, but that meant that 25% of the student body were independents. In other words, they weren't fraternity members. Now, the strange thing was that this was back in the late 60s, 1967. All of the fraternities but one were segregated, which meant no African Americans could be members of the fraternities except one fraternity, and it wasn't a very popular fraternity. Not because they admitted African American students, but because it was considered one of the nerdier fraternities. So people didn't really want to join the Tau Kappa Epsilon, the Teeks, which meant that all of the African Americans on campus were independents, and they lived in the independent dorms, which was great for me because I was an independent, and since the only place that you could interact with African Americans was either in class, which you're in class for whatever, and you can't really talk during class, or the athletic field, or in the dormitories. And so those of us who were independents got to live and be around and to converse with the African Americans on campus. So it was a very fulfilling experience for me and all the other independents, most of the other independents. And so most of us became relatively liberal because we were interacting and we were discussing concepts. We talked about civil rights. Civil rights was not a done deal in 1967. So we went on marches. We did all of these things, and the fraternity guys, of course, they didn't have any African Americans in their fraternities because it was illegal. So they didn't really interact as much with the African Americans as we did, and I found it to be very enlightening. So one of the things that I discovered was that I was comfortable being around people that weren't like me. And that was okay. A lot of the individuals had different ideas. I was around people of different races, and I got used to feeling comfortable with people that weren't, from Muncie, Indiana, farmers from Muncie, Indiana, and that really helped me when I or went into the military, because I could be around anybody, and it didn't bother me. A lot of people, they only wanted to pal around with Catholics or Mormons or Baptists or they had to be around people that were like them because that's what they experienced all their life, and they only felt comfortable around people who were the same as them. But I was really lucky in that when I went to college, I interacted with everybody because I was an independent and not a fraternity person. Now, the fraternity people, there were positives about being in the fraternity as well. These individuals they created networks, and they became if they became wealthy, they helped other people from their fraternities become wealthy. They helped people get jobs. It was they were networked. We weren't networked, but we learned diversity, and I think I thank my lucky stars that I chose not to join a fraternity because I think I've had a more fulfilling life than the people who uh, grew up with a group of people, went to college with that same group of people, and have lived with that same group of people all their lives. Um, I just think it was a real positive experience. So what are we talking about? Okay. Contemporary legends are simply fictional stories that are told in modern societies as if they are true. Booby trapping Halloween candy is one such contemporary legend. There have only been 80 documented cases of doctored booby trapped Halloween candy since 1959. Not a whole lot. Colonies of released alligators live in the sewers of New York City. New York is way too cold for alligators to survive in the winter. The sewers are full of toxic waste that would not support reptilian life. So this is a myth. It's a big story. It's a good one, though. HIV infected needles are being left in coin slots, return slots, to contaminate an unsuspecting person. There has never been a recorded case of anyone contracting HIV from being stuck by a needle in a coin return slot. These are urban legends, they're contemporary legends. Researchers have found that rumors and legends are more likely to spread when they can evoke shared emotional reaction among people. The characters from fiction that are the most memorable are the ones that evoke emotion in us. And the reason I have the picture of Robin Hood is because people get very emotional about robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Emotional ideas are more likely to spread through a culture than are unemotional ones. This is why our news is full of sensational stories of rescues, disasters, and wrecks rather than the mundane things that happen every day. And of course, they had the shooting on Tuesday in Uvalde, Texas, of the elementary students. I think 19 were killed, and 2 teachers, 19 students. They were fourth graders, so they were exactly the same age as my grandson. My grandson's in the 4th grade, so it's a little unnerving. We won't go into how I feel about gun control. I'm ex-military, and I think military people are trained to handle weapons, and civilians are not. So there you go. I won't get into it. The Fulani of Africa believe that the world was created from a drop of milk, and this somewhere on this hat is a picture of that drop of milk. Oh, there it is. It's right here. And that drop of milk became a human. Japanese mythology states that the world was created from brine dripping from the tip of the jeweled spear of heaven. And this is the jeweled spear. Brine is salt water. That's one of the reasons why humans taste salty. Judeo-Christian beliefs state that God created the heavens and earth in 6 days. The kinds of stories that are especially likely to persist in our memories are ones that contain a few minimally counterintuitive ideas. Minimally counterintuitive means that they are statements that are surprising and unusual in the sense that they violate our expectations but are not too outlandish. And I would say this is a boat that looks like a guitar, and that's fairly outlandish because it doesn't look like that's going to, it probably doesn't cut through the water very well. Does globalization mean that we are destined to all become citizens of a homogeneous world culture? Probably not. The trend toward globalization is simultaneously paralleled by an opposing trend toward increasing tribalism. And of course, that's one of the things, if you listen to the news, if you listen to political commentary, one of the problems we seem to be having in the United States is tribalism. Conservatives and liberals. What else? Democrats and Republicans, of course. We're good and they're bad. It's that the idea that some people are good and some people are bad, and people that don't have ideas that are similar to mine are bad people. And that is how tribalism combats the idea that everybody's the same. Ethnically diverse cities such as New York, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney are microcosms of the world at large in many ways. Each has many distinct ethnic enclaves coexisting within their boundaries. Thus, there are trends toward cultural heterogeneity globally, while there is a trend toward cultural homogeneity at the local level. And this is one of the reasons why people voting in Uvalde, Texas, don't vote the same as people in Saley, Arizona. Because they're more homogenous. They're homogenous locally, but more heterogeneous culturally, globally. Cultures that are individualistic include a variety of practices and customs that encourage individuals to place their own personal goals ahead of those of the collective and consider how they are distinct from others. And this is according to Trandis in 1989. Unique practices in individualistic cultures, tracking children at school, and I told you about the bluebirds, yellowbirds, and redbirds. Or maybe that was in another class. I'm sorry. When I was in school, they separated us into 3 reading groups. The bluebirds were the best readers, the redbirds were the second best readers, and the worst readers were in the yellowbird group. And we all read from different books, and the reason we read from different books is because if you were a poor reader, then they wanted to teach you phonics. If you were a intermediate reader, then they wanted to teach you phonics. And if you were a really good reader, then they only taught you sight word. So we were separated, and we were sorted just like they did at Hogwarts. And if you were selected as the above average, of course, the coursework that you had was a little bit more accelerated. It was a little bit more complex. The reading material certainly was better. And that's how they do it in school. Yellowbirds, redbirds, and bluebirds. Workers being given meritocratic pay at the office. This is another individualistic trait. Meritocracy. College-age children being encouraged to move out of their parents' home, kick them out when they turn 18. This is what happened to me. I went off to college at 17 and never came home. Stayed away. I was in college for 4 years, and as soon as I got out of college, I was drafted in, well, not really. I joined the military, and I stayed in the military for 12 years. And then I was married to a military member after I had got out after 12 years. She stayed in, and we wandered around the world for the next, let's see, we got married in 79. For the next 22 years, we wandered around the world. Germany, Japan, Korea, Where else did we go? Montana, California 3 times, Texas 4 times, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Washington D.C., oh, I already told you California, Mississippi. I think I already said Mississippi too. Individualistic cultures, employees being given individual cubicles instead of all working in one glump. People choosing to put their elderly relatives in retirement homes. Collectivistic cultures include many cultural practices, institutions, and customs that encourage individuals to place more emphasis on collective goals, the goals of one's in-group. And wouldn't it be horrible if we all looked like John Malkovich? Children sleeping with their parents is a collectivistic endeavor. Classes of school children being promoted together to the next grade regardless of the performance of some individual children. Marriages being arranged by parents. Companies compensating their employees on the basis of how long they've been employed. Extended families living under one roof. Many surveys reveal that Americans feel more financially pressed than before, even though real incomes have been rising and time pressures have increased as two-career families have become common. Putnam in 2000 speculates that individualism has increased 10%. Suburbanization is another reason for increased individualism. In the United States, according to Putnam, that's Putnam in 2000, and this factor is also at around 10%. Suburbanization results in people spending more time in their cars and in their homes and less time with friends and neighbors. And of course, this is something that changed with the pandemic, and that is one of the reasons why it cut down on fuel consumption in the United States. So they reduced it, and now, of course, we don't have fuel is very expensive, and this is one of the reasons why. The pandemic caused a glut of oil, and once when the pandemic slowed down, of course, people started driving more, and we don't have as much oil on the market. The second largest culprit to increased individualism among Americans at 25% is electronic entertainment, especially television, which leads people to isolate themselves and engage in more passive forms of entertainment. This also includes social media. This also includes gaming. My grandson, he loves to watch. He plays video games, and he loves to watch YouTube videos about playing video games, as weird as that is. So one of the things that we've tried to do is get him outside. He plays on an elite soccer team, and that gets him out practicing 4 or 5 days a week, which is a good thing because it gets him off the damn computer. And his cell phone. He watches videos on his cell phone. Putnam in 2000 discovered that the younger generations even watch TV differently from the way that their parents and grandparents do, as they're more likely to turn the TV on even if there is nothing in particular that they have in mind to watch. The older generations are more likely to watch TV only when there is a particular show that they want to see. My wife and I only turn on the television when we're watching it. We don't just let it run. My daughter, my son, they have the television on like all the time, and usually they're not even watching it. Now, personally, I find it distracting when the television's on and people are trying to talk to me, because now I've got all this background noise and I have a difficult time understanding what is being said. Approximately half of the variance between the increasing individualism rests with the different lifestyles between the younger and older generations, and this is according to Putnam in 2000. Now, this was 22 years ago, so things have changed a lot. 22 years ago, we couldn't play video games on our telephones. We couldn't watch television on our telephones, but now, of course, we can. And this is one of the reasons why what Putnam was finding is probably not quite as accurate with today's society. One of the most remarkable findings regarding cultural change is that people seem to be getting smarter. On average, across all cultures for which there is longitudinal data, people in the current generation have higher IQ scores than those from earlier generations. This is a little strange for me because one of the things I didn't tell you when I was talking about the bluebirds, yellowbirds, and redbirds was that most of the bluebirds scored in the genius level. Now, the genius level back in 1955 was not what the genius level is today. And I always thought, geez, I'm doing okay. I've got a pretty good high IQ score. But as time has gone by, the IQ scores have been going up and up and up. And where I am is just barely in the genius level now. I was pretty happy with my score before. Of course, they didn't tell me what my score was until I was in my 30s or 40s. My parents finally told me what my IQ was. Geez, if I had known that back, when I was in my 20s, I would have tried harder, that kind of a thing. Anyway, not important. This is what's going on. The trend of intelligence rising has been dubbed the Flynn effect after the researcher who first identified it. And here is Mr. Flynn right here. He first identified it in 1987, and then he once again identified it in 1994. And this is a picture of him from about 20 years ago when everybody didn't have beards. So, and you can see how goofy his hair looks. Anyway, so he was quite the character back in the 1987, 1994. A review of changes in IQ scores in 14 nations revealed that the average increase in IQ was between 5 and 25 points per generation. And per generation means about every 10 years. Is that right? Maybe it's every 20 years. Maybe every 12 years. Anyway, a generation. Well, let's look it up. I'm not sure. That is an inaccurate figure. Let me see. Oops, that's not what I want. That's what I want. Okay. How long is a generation? Is a generation 25 years. Okay, so every 25 years, IQ scores go up 25 to, wait a minute. Here we go. Okay. Every 25, go up 5 to 25 points every 25 years. There we go. According to Healy in 1990, most TV programming communicates at about the 4th grade vocabulary level. And if you listen to television, it's fairly easy to follow, mainly because they don't use big words. So I'll try not to use, and I don't really believe in this. I think we need to communicate at whatever level you guys understand. If it's too complex for you, if I use a word that you don't understand, I invite you to look them up. That's what you really need to do. You need to communicate at the college level. You're in college now. I'm at a little bit higher than that, but I need to be able to communicate with you. And if I'm using words that you don't understand, like if you were speaking Dene to me, I wouldn't understand what you're saying. I was in a meeting one time with O.J. Vicente. This was an assessment meeting, and we would have assessment meetings every month. And whenever he talked, he always spoke in Dene. Well, I was supposed to be the secretary, and of course, I'm supposed to be writing this down. Half the time, he's just really growling and talking in Navajo, and of course, I had no clue what he was saying. So I just wrote down what he had said in English last and what he said in English next, because sometimes people would translate for me, and sometimes they wouldn't. I think part of the time he was saying something fairly negative about me, but that's okay. OJ and I are understand each other. he's he's a hoot. Anyway, okay. So television's at the fourth grade level, and this is important. If I'm using too big of words, or if I say something that you don't understand, either look it up or ask me, and I'll be glad to change my way of communicating, because I need to communicate with you. I don't believe in speaking over people or over students. Sometimes I may use a word that comes from the old days, like groovy or whatever. Just ask me, and I'll be glad to tell you. My whole purpose in teaching is to communicate. Of men born in 1890, only 27% had more than an eighth grade education, and only 9% had any schooling after high school. In 2012, the percentage of Americans over 25 who had more than an eighth grade education was approximately 94%. 58% had some schooling after high school, and approximately 11% had graduate degrees. And of course, I am one of those 11%. I have 3 graduate degrees. How in the world did I ever do that? Now, the reality is that people that go on for their master's degrees or for a PhD, a lot of times these individuals were given scholarships, or they came from rich families. And that's the only way that in the old days, that's just about the only way you could do it. Now you can borrow money, of course, to be able to do this. I cheated, and I don't mind telling you. Two of my 2 master's degrees I received while I was in the military, and the military paid for those 2 master's degrees. My PhD, I had to pay for. Well, actually, my wife paid for it, but I've been trying to pay her back. I've had it for 10 years, my PhD. And despite the fact I didn't come from a rich family, and despite the fact I didn't have all the scholarship money to deal with, I have been able to finish my PhD, and here I am at Dene College. And this is where I will retire. I can promise you that I have no plans. I'm 73 years old, and people say, "Geez, you're 73. You should have retired by now." And I say, "Well, I'm not quite ready yet." But Dene College is going to be my last teaching assignment. So once I'm done, I'm done. Uh, you guys are going, hurry up and get done. Or not. I hope you're being nice. One of the things that I can talk about is that my own father, uh, my grandfather, thought that an education to the eighth grade was as much as you needed. And my dad graduated from high school he was in the eighth grade. Let me see, how old was he? What is the eighth grade? 14, 13, 14, in 1931. And his father told him, "You're done. You finished the eighth grade." My dad said, "No, I want to go to high school." And my grandfather said, "I only had a third grade education, and I've invented this and this and this." And he did. My grandfather invented banking tracks, or banking railroad tracks, so that they didn't fly off the rails. He also invented banking roads so that you could go faster around the roads. Now, one of the things you have to remember, I'm 73 years old. My dad would be over 100 now. He'd be 104. So my grandfather invented this when cars went really slow. But he decided that if you bank the turn, then you could, he invented this, and he did it with the Indianapolis 500. That's one of the reasons why the Indianapolis 500 is such a famous place, is because people could go faster there than they could go anyplace else. All the other tracks were flat tracks. They had no bank curves, and my grandfather was the first one to bank the curve. Now you think, geez, he must have made a lot of money, and the answer is no. he was smart about banking curves, but he was stupid about finances, and he did it. And they just about tore it out until somebody actually went around the track and could slingshot out of that bank turn. So he got in trouble, and they fired him for banking the turn so much. But once he did it, it was a southwest corner was the first one that he banked. Once he did that, then they banked the rest of the turns, and the Indianapolis 500 became the most famous racetrack in the world, all because of my grandfather. The other thing he invented was the backhoe, as weird as that sounds, and I'll try not to get into that. And he didn't make any money off that either. So one of the things that you need to remember, we know that there were people that flew before the Wright brothers. So why are the Wright brothers called the first in flight? It's because they were the ones that were able to market it. Uh, uh, Wait a minute, what's the guy's name? Henry Ford wasn't the first person to build an assembly line. That was done in Kokomo, Indiana by, what was the guy's name? I can't think of the guy's name. Anyway, he was the first person to put together an assembly line. And it was stolen, borrowed, copied by Henry Ford, and Henry Ford became famous for being able to build Ford cars at a rapid pace because of this assembly line. I can't think of the guy's name. Anyway, it was the first assembly line, automobile assembly line was in Kokomo, Indiana, not Detroit, Michigan. Anyway, not important. Or maybe it is important. That's why I started to mention this. So the idea is that it isn't the person that comes up with the idea, it's the person that markets the idea. They're the ones that become rich. Uh, Bill Gates didn't invent programming. Um, he he was one of the individuals that marketed the software, the Microsoft software, and that's why he became such a wealthy man. So a lot of times it's a person that markets it that is the wealthy person. Anyway, not important. Throughout the 20th century until the last couple of decades, people were able to get by with as little as an eighth grade education. You could do that. I mean, it was okay. I come from Indiana, where there were a lot of factories. There aren't anymore. And I was educated in a school that taught you how to work in a factory. We had two directions that you could go. You could either become a factory worker or you could become a farmer. And that's what everybody in our area did. There were some people that would go on to college and become teachers. That's what I did. But you can make a lot more money in the factory. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons that my first wife and I had disagreements is because my wife's family were factory workers, and she knew that I could make a lot more money if I quit college and went into the factory. And of course, I didn't do that. I stayed in college, and then I joined the military, and I'm still not making enough money for her. So eventually, she decided to run off with a guy that was getting out of the service to become a factory worker. And she didn't stay with him. That's not important. She didn't stay with him. She left him, him and hooked up with somebody else. I think a truck driver, but he was making pretty good money. But she liked money. In the 21st century, it takes some college to get by, and there is an ever-growing proportion obtaining graduate degrees. So that's just about what you have to do. Now, the reality is, and I need to tell you guys this, the reality is that in order to be a counselor, you need a degree. There are jobs for people with bachelor's degrees in psychology, but if you're going to become a counselor, if you're going to really go anywhere in psychology, you'll need to go and get at least a master's degree, if not a PhD. So that's just something to think about. On the Navajo Nation, of course, it is possible to be able to work in the field with just a bachelor's degree. There are lots of jobs on the reservation for people like that, people with just a bachelor's degree. But on the outside, if you're in Chicago, or you want to move to Chicago or New York City or Phoenix or Los Angeles and become a counseling psychologist, you're going to need a master's degree at least. Sorry, but you can work on the reservation. There are other places where you can work. You can work in Montana, not Washington State, um, North Dakota, South Dakota. There are places where you can work with just a bachelor's degree. Societies are always looking for scapegoats to explain problems that they don't understand. In Europe, a frequent scapegoat has been alien religions, especially Judaism. Now, you may ask yourself, "Well, how in the world did the Jewish people, since Jesus was a Jew, how in the world did the Jewish people become the villains of Christianity?" And the answer is, they held a conference and they were trying to decide who were the bad guys and who were the good guys. This is like in 400 AD. This is right, Jesus had died 400 years before. They were trying to decide who were going to be the good guys and who were going to be the bad guys. And they realized that in order for their religion to expand, they needed to expand into the Roman Empire. And so we all know the story of how Jesus died. The Pontius Pilate asked the Jewish population if they wanted to save Jesus or not, and they voted not to save him, to allow him to be executed, and the Romans executed him, and that's what the crucifixion was all about. Okay, so they had to decide, are the bad people the Jewish people that voted not to save him, or are the bad people the people that actually executed him, the Romans? And what they decided was, well, since we probably won't go anywhere if the Jewish people are the good guys and the Romans are the bad guys, we better pick the Romans as the good guys, and the Jewish people as the bad guys. And that's what they did. And that has been a stigma with Christians ever since. And you can still find groups of Christians in the world who persecute Jewish people. And this, of course, is something in not only the Roman Catholic Church and in the Protestant Church, but also in the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. They also dislike Jewish people and have blamed them for just about everything. As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons why when Hitler decided he was going to exterminate all the Jewish people in Europe and wherever he was, there were not that many people that said, "No, don't do it." There were individuals, of course, that did, but not governments saying, you can't do that. As a matter of fact, there were Jewish people fleeing Europe at the time. They got on boats and they tried to flee, but they couldn't find any country that would take them. Why? Well, it's because of this old myth that the Jewish people are to blame for the crucifixion of Christ. So the Jewish people became the scapegoats, okay? Judaism became the scapegoats. So anytime anything bad happened, it was because of Jewish people. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague and other devastating diseases like leprosy swept through Europe. Whose fault was it? It was the Jewish people. Looking for someone to blame, Europeans began blaming the Jews for poisoning their wells. These beliefs led to pogroms in most of European countries, including Germany, the Ukraine, and Russia. This is a picture. This is from 1939 in Lviv. We've heard a lot about Lviv. They were beating Jewish people to death, chasing them through the street and beating them to death. They've torn this lady's clothes off. She's in her underwear, and you can see the little boy with the stick. They're beating them. She's got a bloody nose. You can see the picture. These are known as pogroms. and they have erupted. They erupted throughout the 2,000 years since, or the 1,600 years since they decided Jewish people were the villains in the story. So this has happened all over the world. Happened in Spain. The Inquisition, the famous Spanish Inquisition was about trying to get rid of all the Jewish people. What they told the Jewish people that they could either convert to Christianity or they had to leave or they would be executed. So most of the Jewish people left, but some of the Jewish people converted to Christianity, and the Spanish Inquisition started out as them trying to find blasphemers, as they were trying to find Jewish people that hadn't actually converted and that they were doing their Jewish rites in secret. And that's what the Spanish Inquisition started as. It got all wrapped up into other ugly things. Anyway, this is all part of religious history. Not the prettiest part, of course, but this is part of history as well. And this is in the Ukraine, Lviv, and of course we've heard about Lviv because the Russians weren't able to conquer Lviv, but this is a pogrom in 1939. In the 1920s, the Nazi Party gained power throughout Germany based in part on the platform of blaming all Germany's problems on the Jewish population. There was a relatively large Jewish population in Germany, and Hitler decided that, hey, this is a perfect person to blame for all the problems that Germany has. That way, if we can just say it was the Jews' fault, then politically we can take all the positive things, and anytime anything negative happens, we can blame it on the Jews. Research by Voigtlander and Voth in 2012 disclosed that German cities that had Jewish pogroms in the 14th century were the same cities that had higher rates of violence against Jews in the 1920s and had higher support for the Nazi Party. Now, why is this important? Well, the 1920s, the Nazi Party wasn't really in charge in Germany. They wouldn't take charge until 1932. But in the 1920s, they were gaining power, and they, of course, were blaming the Jews, and therefore they would start these riots where Jewish people, they broke their windows and whatnot. They were persecuting Jewish people and blaming them for all the bad stuff that was going on in Germany. And then but of course, the ones that had the most violence and the highest support for the Nazi Party were the ones that were also the ones that had the Jewish pogroms in the 14th century. Because cultures evolve from their past circumstances, the early conditions of a culture matter a great deal with respect to how cultures subsequently evolve. The critical role of early conditions is one important reason that cultural differences can persist across time. Boston was settled by Protestant Puritans. Puritanism emphasized respect for authority and the importance of applying wealth and social position to community goals. Many of the original Puritans were highly educated intellectuals, and they felt that their dream of forming a utopia would emerge only from an educated population. Philadelphia was settled by Protestant Quakers. My people were Quakers too, by the way. They came over in the early 1600s. Quakerism emphasizes pragmatic concerns, individual equality, and tolerance. The Quakers built the University of Pennsylvania with a utilitarian curriculum with medical, business, and engineering schools dominating the university. The school received little community or financial support from the Quaker culture as it had little trust in higher education. So Quakers don't really believe in higher education. Well, actually, they do believe in higher education, but they are not trying to educate their preachers because the Quaker, the fringe church, doesn't believe in preachers. They don't have a preacher. They just have people that stand up. Usually, it's an elder will stand up and they will talk. But whereas the Puritan church always has a religious leader, the Quakers do not have religious leaders. So creating leaders was not the purpose for the University of Pennsylvania and the Quakers of Philadelphia. The Puritans built Harvard University using a liberal arts curriculum that emphasized community service. Now, if you went to the University of Pennsylvania in the 18th or 19th century, you would either study medicine, you would study business, or you would study engineering. You wouldn't study anything else, and that's all you studied. If you studied medicine, that's all you studied. But at Harvard, you studied everything because because they were trying to build leaders at Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania were trying to build doctors, businessmen, and engineers. But at Harvard, they were trying to create leaders. The university received tremendous community and financial support and is today the most heavily endowed private institution in the United States at $32.9 billion. I looked this up. I looked this up last semester to find out just how much they had, and it's 32.9 billion. That's a lot of money. The number of political leaders coming out of Harvard has been strong from its founding until today because Harvard builds leaders. That was the emphasis of the Puritans. Now, the Puritans and Quakers are a lot different. Boston's culture has maintained its elitism, the Boston Brahmins, and respect for authority that can be traced back to its Puritan roots. And this is a picture of a Boston Brahmin with his nose in the air, with his funny accent. Philadelphia's culture has remained distrustful of authority and hard to govern, yet tolerant of diversity. And of course, Will Smith is about to drop the microphone because he's Will Smith. Okay. As people immigrated to Boston and Philadelphia, they tended to adjust themselves to the prevailing cultural traditions as established by Puritans and Quakers, respectively. Hence, the cities have been able to maintain the cultural traditions of their forebears. So if you went to Philadelphia, either you would change to their way of thinking or you would leave. Or you had that idea before you came. If you moved to Boston, you either had their way of thinking or you left. You went someplace else. As a matter of fact, that's why Rhode Island exists because the Bostons kicked out, the people from Boston, the Puritans kicked out a select group of individuals, Roger Williams, and he established the state of Rhode Island as a alternative to the Boston and Puritan way of thinking. Often we try to figure out what others are thinking when all we have to go on is what people tell us or our observations of how they behave. Pluralistic ignorance is a tendency for people to collectively misinterpret the thoughts that underlie other people's behavior. And of course, this is an interesting cartoon. All these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on. And of course, everybody is telling themselves that they have no idea what's going on. A good example of pluralistic ignorance was divulged in the studies done looking at the German people after World War II by Hannah Arendt in 1964. Arendt determined that Nazism was not followed because the German people were evil. It was followed because they were thoughtless and conforming. Now the reality is, every time there's a shooting like this, we just had one in Buffalo, and now the shooting on Tuesday by Salvador. What was his last name? I can't remember his last name. People say, well, it was just, this man is just evil. Now the reality is, no, he's just thoughtless. And conforming to a form of, or to a way of looking at things. So calling people evil, sure, the Nazis were evil, but all of Germany were evil. No, that's not right. All of Germany were following the Nazis. So does that make all the Germans evil? And this is one of the things, this is one of the reasons why Milgram did his experiment. This is what Hannah Arendt was doing research on. there were so many people that were trying to figure out how the Nazis could get away with all of this and why the German people, who are nice people individually, why they didn't do something about it. And the answer is because they're conforming. Just like with the Milgram experiment, when somebody tells you to do something, you do it, even if it goes against your fiber, and that's what Milgram proved. This is really kind of an interesting picture because this guy right here, everybody's giving the Nazi salute. That's the fascist salute. So don't do that with your hand extended and your arm extended. That's your right arm, of course. That is the Nazi salute. And you'll see it in war movies about World War II. But this guy right here doesn't have his arm out. And probably he didn't survive. He didn't survive because he didn't conform. Just something to think about. That I'm real upset about. I hate to think that my grandson is in danger just because he's going to school. Some idiot, some thoughtless and conforming idiot decides that guns are more important than children's lives. That he's going to shoot up the school. It isn't because he's evil. It's because he's thoughtless and conforming. And the only way to control that type of thought process is through new laws. Sorry, I'm getting political, and I don't really mean to. But this whole idea that something happened just because somebody is evil is just not. It's not a good excuse. Anyway, we won't discuss that anymore. And I think that's the end of the chapter. There we go. Okay. So I'll see you guys next week. We'll talk about something